In this video, I want to give you just a short introduction to the problem we're dealing with when we talk about JavaScript development or building web apps and that. Uh, and so if we look over here, right, so the development environment is the world of too many choices and that. And this is just a small list that popped into my head real quick. If we did an more exhaustive search on the different dimensions, we would come up with even more choices. Okay. So one of the first ones is, are we going to do it locally at home on my computer, or I'm going to use a desktop? So right away we could have subtle differences between how a local setup is than the VDI setup, the Z drive, certain way profiles are managed locally versus in a remote environment that can have some side effects on what it feels like to develop the JavaScript and that. So in terms of having a development server or dev server, are you using the Vite server for development, or are you going to use HTTP server for development, or are you going to use no server for development? You're just going to go off the file protocol. And that's a little bit harder to do because you get CORS issues in that. So you usually want to bump up to either Vite or HTTP server in that. And then JavaScript style, there's way more choices in here, just so you know. So it could be where I'm just going to have an HTML file, and I'll have script tags, and inside those script tags, I'll have all my JavaScript code. And that's sort of like PHP, Java server pages, active server pages in that. Or you can have some HTML and some JavaScript where you start teasing apart. You start working towards, some sort of separation of concerns. You start tearing it apart, right? But there's even stages to that, where you're still doing a lot of stuff in HTML in that. And then you go to a stage where you're doing even less in HTML and more in JavaScript. And there is this thing where a switch goes off and it becomes very different. Minimal HTML as at the least amount possible done in the HTML file. It stays pretty clean. Maybe it has a div, and after that, a reference to a script to run, and that's it. There's nothing else in there. And so that minimal one is where things really start to change, okay? But you still might be doing stuff up in the head of the HTML document to link in JavaScript libraries, okay? And so the last phase would be, we're going to do minimal HTML. I mean, just enough divs, just enough HTML elements to have something to hook to from the back end. Everything is going to be done in JavaScript, even setting up the events, like when someone clicks on a button. And that the registration will be done back in the JavaScript. But we'll also be using the ECMA 6 modules. So the I go ECMA 6 because that's the level of the standard. And in there, one of the things they introduced was the import command and the concept of a JavaScript module, so that you didn't need require.js and common.js in that. And we could add those two to this list here. We get even bigger, right? How do you want to do your imports and that? And so there's this transition from how we wrote HTML in the late 90s, when it was just HTML and JavaScript was just introduced, to today, where we have this import command available to us for a long time now, because the ECMA 6, EM6 came out a while back, but it wasn't for the last 2 or 3 years where it's starting to really take off in terms of people really leveraging the import command. And it does mean people have to rewrite some of their libraries, and sometimes they can use something called ESBuild that will actually, kind of rewrite their libraries on the fly to make them more compliant with ECMA 6 and the ability to import within your JavaScript. And then how are you going to test? Like when you're running your thing and something's going wrong and you're doing some like console log stuff and you want to see those errors, are you going to do that in Chrome, Firefox, or are we going to use the built-in light browser that comes with the Vite extension, right? Which I mentioned down below in that, because then when you're testing, like where do you go to see those messages? That kind of changes too. And then the Vite extension, are you going to use the Vite extension? There's a whole bunch of stuff that shows up on the status bar, a bunch of other tools that show up that you can use that help you out in that. Or are you going to? I'm going to use all the ECMA 6 stuff. I'm going to use Vite as the development server, but I don't really need the extension, right? I don't need all the little doodads and widgets and gizmos that show up in VS Code in strange places in that. And so, because again, that gives you a different feel for when you develop. Where do you go to fire up the server? Where do you go to see console like error message or debug messages that you might be printing out in your code. Where do you go to see those? And that. And then if you're going to be working with building an app, or you're going to use some sort of templating system. So lots of different apps. Like if you're going to do a certain style of app, like you're going to do an app that uses open layers, right? Are you going to use their template because that sets the project up in a certain way? Or are you going to go, no, you're going to add it all. You'll build your own template in that. So are you going to be using someone's template or not in that? And so if we look at that, what would that current math be, right? 2 times 3 times 5 times 2 times 2 times 2, 240 possible combinations. That's really important. You could have 240 different look and feels to how you do a very simple app, depending on your choices in that. And so that's a lot. And this is just what popped into my head in a few minutes. This is not an exhaustive search. And it didn't take us very long to get here at all. And that's why you might see someone writing some JavaScript and go, wow, that looks really different than what I'm doing. Because they changed one of these options. And so they ended up down a different branch of how it would look and feel when you're working with the code and that, developing, testing, building, and that. So I just want to go over, like, that's the issue that we're dealing with. It's real, but we can manage it. We just have to decide, right, how we want to do that. That's all for now.